On the night of February 1, 1959, 9 young hikers slashed open their own tent from the inside, and ran barefoot into a Siberian blizzard where temperatures had plunged to negative 30 degrees Celsius. Every single one of them died. When investigators finally recovered the bodies, one woman was missing her tongue, 2 had chest fractures so severe that a car crash couldn't have caused them, and fragments of their clothing tested positive for radioactive contamination. The Soviet government sealed the case and blamed, and I quote, an unknown compelling force. 66 years later, no one has proven them wrong. What happened on that mountain? Let's find out. The group was led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, now Ekaterinburg. He was experienced. He'd organized multiple expeditions across the northern Urals before. This trip was supposed to be a Category 3 ski trek, the hardest classification in the Soviet system, across the remote highlands of Kholat Syakhl, a peak whose name in the indigenous Mansi language translates, ominously, to Dead Mountain. There were 10 hikers originally. One member, Yuri Yudin, turned back on January 28 due to joint pain. That decision saved his life. He would become the sole survivor of the group, though he'd spend the rest of his days tormented by guilt and unanswered questions. He died in 2013, still not knowing what killed his friends. The remaining 9 pushed forward, 7 men and 2 women, aged 21 to 37. They were fit, prepared, and well-equipped for Soviet-era winter trekking. Their route diaries and photographs, recovered later from the tent, show a group in good spirits, laughing, posing for the camera, even publishing a humorous trail newspaper they called the Otorten Evening. On February 1, they set up camp on the exposed slope of Kholat Syakhl at an elevation of about 1,079 meters, rather than descending to the tree line where they'd have had shelter from the wind. Why they chose that exposed position has never been adequately explained. And what happened next turned a routine expedition into the most enduring mystery of the 20th century. But here's where it gets strange. When the group failed to send a telegram from the endpoint village of Vizhai by February 12, their expected return date, no alarm was raised immediately. It wasn't until February 20 that a search party of volunteer students and faculty set out. On February 26, they found the tent on the mountainside. What they saw didn't make sense. The tent was partially collapsed, half buried in snow, and it had been cut open from the inside with a knife-long, desperate slashes. The hikers' boots, outer coats, and most of their warm clothing were still inside. Whoever left the tent left in a panic so absolute that they chose a negative 30-degree night over whatever was behind them. Now ask yourself, what would you have done? What could possibly make 9 rational, experienced hikers abandon their only shelter, their only chance of survival, without even stopping to put on shoes? Searchers followed a trail of footprints, remarkably orderly, side by side, not scattered in chaos, leading roughly 1.5 kilometers downslope toward the tree line. At the edge of the forest, beneath a large cedar tree, they found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivoniskenko. They were in their underwear. Their hands were torn and bloody. Broken branches up to 5 meters high on the cedar showed they had climbed the tree, desperately, possibly trying to see something, or get away from something. A makeshift fire had been started nearby, but it had burned out. They froze to death. 3 more bodies were found between the cedar and the tent, at intervals along the slope, Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. Their positions suggested they had been trying to crawl back to the tent. Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, yet the skin on his head was unbroken. No external wound. He'd been struck by something with tremendous force or had fallen, but the pathologist noted the injury alone wouldn't have been immediately fatal. All 3 died of hypothermia. It took more than 2 months, until May 4, to find the last 4 bodies. They were buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine, 75 meters from the cedar tree. And this is where the Dyatlov Pass case crosses the line from tragedy into nightmare. Ludmila Dubinina, 21 years old, was found with her tongue, the floor of her mouth, and part of her lips missing. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had catastrophic skull fractures. Semyon Zolotaryov and Dubinina both had massive chest fractures, their ribs crushed inward with a force the chief examiner, Boris Vozrozdeny, compared to being hit by a car. Yet there were no external soft tissue wounds consistent with those injuries. No bruising patterns. No signs of a beating. Vozrozdeny stated on record that no human being could have inflicted this damage with their hands or a weapon without leaving surface marks. And then, the radiation. Soviet investigators tested the clothing and found that several garments, particularly those on Kolevatov and Zolotaryov, showed beta radiation contamination levels significantly above normal background. This detail was partially suppressed in the original inquest. The case was officially closed on May 28, 1959, with the conclusion that all 9 died from a spontaneous force which the hikers were unable to overcome. The files were then sealed and classified. So let's lay this out. We have 9 people who fled in terror. No attacker. No avalanche debris covering the tent. Internal injuries without external trauma. A missing tongue. Radioactive clothing. And a government that locked it all away for decades. What exactly happened on that mountain? Over the decades, more than 75 theories have been proposed. An avalanche, the Russian government's own 2020 reinvestigation endorsed a small slab avalanche as the trigger. Researchers Johann Gaum and Alexander Puzrin published a 2021 study in the journal Communications Earth and Environment supporting this, using advanced modeling to show that a delayed slab release could have caused the chest and skull injuries. It's the most scientifically grounded explanation. But critics point out there was no avalanche debris on or around the tent. The footprints leading away were calm and orderly, not the chaotic scramble you'd expect, and it doesn't explain the radiation. It doesn't explain the missing tongue, though some pathologists attribute that to natural decomposition in running water, since Dubinina was found face down in a stream bed. Other theories range from Soviet military weapons testing. There were reports from other hikers and Monsey villagers of strange orange orbs in the sky that February, and the region was within range of missile test corridors from Baikonur to infrasound generated by wind passing over the mountain dome, known as a Kármán vortex, which can induce panic, nausea, and irrational terror in humans. Some have suggested a confrontation with the indigenous Monsey people, but the investigation cleared them thoroughly. Others have pointed to Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest member at 37, who had a murky wartime background and may have had connections to Soviet intelligence, raising the question of whether the group stumbled onto something they were never meant to see. Here's what haunts me: we have more data on this case than on almost any other wilderness disaster in history. Photographs, diaries, autopsy reports, radiation tests, 66 years of analysis. And still, not a single theory accounts for every piece of evidence. Every explanation requires you to ignore something. The avalanche theory ignores the radiation. The military theory ignores the lack of any physical evidence of weapons. The infrasound theory ignores the crushing injuries. The Monsey people had a name for Kholat Syakhl long before 1959. Dead Mountain. Maybe they knew something that 9 hikers, a Soviet investigation, and 6 decades of modern science still haven't figured out. Or maybe the answer is buried in those classified files, the ones that weren't released in the 1990s. The ones no one has ever seen. What do you think happened that night? This has been Obscura Files. If this case left you with more questions than answers, good. That means you're paying attention. Drop your theory in the comments. I read every single one. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell. We cover the darkest, strangest, most unexplained chapters in human history, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Until then, stay curious. Stay skeptical. And whatever you do, don't pitch your tent on Dead Mountain.